everyone, I'm Emery Lee, author of Me Cute Diary.
And I'm Sonora Reyes, author and host of QPOC Chat.
And today we are going to talk about some of the things that we are looking for in PitchWars and answer some questions that were posed to us either on Twitter specifically for us, or just general questions that have been posted as far as asking mentors what they're looking for in PitchWars and how to go about submitting. So a note, Sonora and I are not working as co-mentors. We are actually going to be individual mentors. So when it comes time to send your submissions to us, you're going to want to pick which of us you want to work with. If there are any questions answered in this video that make you particularly inclined to work with one of us, please keep track of who said what and who requested what, because you're going to want to match up with the one of us who said what matches with you, not necessarily just sending to both of us because we're both in this video.
Yeah, though you can send to both of us because you can send up to 4 mentors.
Yes, so you can send to both of us, but yeah, I think it's best to keep in mind who exactly you do want to query, because you may want to send to both of us, you may only want to send to one of us. But remember, this is PitchWars, so it's a rivalry.
Wait, pretend to stab me.
I'm gonna stab you!
Okay, so I would say like what I'm looking for in a query is, the main thing is I'm just checking to make sure it doesn't hit my do not submit list, and then I want to just see if it's something that's up my alley. What stands out is definitely if it's something that's on my wish list, like one of my specific, like, please send me like like this or that. Make sure you have them introduce the main character, introduce the stakes, and introduce what the main like decision or event is that's gonna like change everything, and what happens if the main character like fails. So like what those stakes are. I think that's like the pretty basics of like what you need in a query.
Yeah, I think for me when I look at a query, I look for essentially the 3 elements of your character's arc. So who they were, who they are now, and who they have the potential to become. Basically who they were before the inciting incident, who they become, who they are now as they're like exploring the plot, and then the stakes that will ultimately change them for the better or for the worse. And then like of course like just like the general things like your comps, your bio, like all that kind of stuff should all be in the query.
Word count, title, genre, age category. Well, we all know what the age category is.
But yeah, but I feel like the most important thing to have in your query is just going to be those key points of your character's journey, because if you don't have comps, or if your word count is vague or something, like I can kind of work around that. If I feel like the story is good enough, then like what's going to matter is going to be the pages. But I kind of want to know essentially what your big storyline is going to be. Like, I need to know essentially from the query that you have a character that has some sort of depth and journey to go through, and then therefore that you have like intentions for where this character is going to go with like what's going to happen with, in terms of like the stakes and the actual like plot of the story. I feel like as long as there's a grasp of those elements, the rest I can kind of gauge as I start to read the pages.
Yeah.
And the other big thing, of course, is like when you're writing your query, if there's an element of like an aesthetic or like a tone or a mood that's like really strong in the query, that can make your query really stand out, because it'll make the story feel more alive even before I start reading those pages. So I think that's probably one of the best things to put in a query as far as like to grab my attention. I don't necessarily want something that's like, I don't necessarily want like gimmicky, like, smart jokes or like, kind of like trying to be like witty cleverness. What I want is just to feel like, as I'm reading it, I want it to kind of feel like I'm standing in a bookstore reading a synopsis. And like a cover flap, like what is it that this story brings? What's the energy behind the story? I feel like that's the thing that's going to sway me the most at the query stage.
Basically the query, I just want to know, like the question is like, do I want to read this book? And most of the time, if that answer like is going to be no, it's because of something that it's just so subjective, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's like the pages, you know?
Yeah, essentially the query is just to give us a taste of the story so that we can say, like, this is not a book I would read, or this sounds like a book I would read, and it's generally going to be a hit or miss. Like, you're either going to have elements in that story that straight up tell me this is not a book that I would have any reason reading, or you'll have elements that tell me this is a story that I could be interested in. As long as you get my, like, could be interested in, like, mentality in there, I'm gonna read the pages. So, essentially, as long as you're not sending me something that's like on my do not read list, or just straight up something that I know I have no understanding or, like, comprehension of, then I will read the pages. So your query is just to get that interest there. It doesn't in and of itself have to carry the weight of the book, it just has to pique my interest.
Yeah. I think if you don't have comps, no one's gonna reject because you don't have comps. If you have good comps, someone might read faster for you. So if you have, like, comps that I'm really feeling, I might, you know, bump you to the front of the line or something and read yours first. But if you don't have any comps, if you don't have any comps, I'm personally not going to reject just because you don't have any comps. What did I say wrong?
This is a mild disagreement, which is why I'm not stabbing you yet.
Okay.
I actually feel like when it comes to comps, my rule of thumb is comps tell me more about how the author sees their work than how the work might necessarily play out. And I'm going to explain that in a second. But a common thing I find with comps is that it's not that your book doesn't have comps, it's that you don't know what comps to use.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, especially when it comes to the agent stage, but also just, you know, in terms of mentorship. I feel like as a potential mentee, you should use this time almost as like a test run for querying agents. So when you pitch a book and you can't add a single comp for your book at all, what it tells me is that you either don't know the market or you don't know your own book. And this is to say that, like, your book doesn't have to be exactly like anything on the market. But if you can't find anything on the market to comp to your book at all, you know, and remember, keep in mind, comps don't have to be, my book is literally, you know, Sticks of Crows meets Throne of Glass. But comps should be something that give the reader of this query an idea of where your story fits in the market in terms of tone, in terms of character, in terms of plot. So if you're writing a story, even if you're writing a story about, you know, rabid bears that turn into aliens and feed on, like, leeches that are, like, part carrot, like, yeah, that's going to be a really weird story, and there is nothing like that on the market. But if the plot arc of your story is similar to a zombie survival story, then comp to a zombie survival.
Yeah, you can comp to things like it has a you know, sarcastic voice, like blah 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 blah, or it has, like, you know, whimsical vibe like this book. You know, it doesn't have to be like they have actual similar, like, plots at all.
Yeah, so essentially, and I feel like this is really important, and I feel like this is a really important skill for authors to learn, but I think when you go to sell your own work, you know, if you can't think of anything else on the market like it, what you're telling publishers is that, you know, there's no, I guess, reassurance to them that your book is going to sell. And so it's not so much that you have to know exactly, you know, what book that came out in the past year is exactly like your own book. And you don't have to comp to books necessarily either. You can always comp to video games, to movies, to TV shows, to songs, you know. There are so many things you can comp to. So I think, you know, the idea of not having a single comparison that you can make kind of gives the impression that you don't know your own work well. So I will not reject your story purely on the fact that you don't have comps. I don't feel like comps are a legitimate reason to feel like a book doesn't stand a chance. If a book is good, a book is good. But I do, I'm a bit wary of the advice that comps don't matter, or that you know, don't really worry about comps. They're not a big deal. Well, they can be. And I think, you know, especially in this case where you're trying to essentially you know, show this mentor that you are the one who should be chosen among, you know, however many submissions. I think showing that you know your own story well enough to comp it to something else and that you know the market is a very good way to show that you have been doing your research and that you're well prepared for what comes next.
So that's true. I want to add a caveat to what I said earlier, is I don't necessarily think you shouldn't worry about comps like at all, just that like for me personally as a mentor, it's not something that I would reject over, though like if I ended up choosing a mentee who didn't have any comps, we would definitely come up with comps. Like, it's not something we wouldn't worry about. It's something we would, you know, come up with and fix that, you know, gap for when they query. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, like I said, like if your book is good, your book is good. And like, even if you put the worst comps ever, like, you know, if your book sounds like something I would read, I'm going to read the pages. And if I read the pages and I like it, it's not going to matter that your comps were terrible. Or that you didn't have any. Like at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. But I do think that it's definitely something to be aware of. And I also think it's better to have no comps than have bad comps.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's better to have no comps than have bad comps. But I do think it is helpful, at the very least, to comp to a story that you feel carries the same emotional resonance as your own. So even if you wrote, you know, I don't know, a fantasy novel about angels, if you felt that it has the same emotional resonance as The Land Before Time, at least give me that. You know, at least tell me like this is the kind of emotional journey you're going to be taking with this story. I feel like that will tell me a lot.
Yeah, I'm actually going to give an example. One of my friends wrote a book that is nothing necessarily like Hot Dog Girl, but it has like a similar romance arc. Like, so there's like a bisexual love triangle that follows the, like similar beats or something. So she comped to that in her query letter, like it has a similar romance arc to Hot Dog Girl. So it doesn't have to be like,
yeah, it doesn't have to be a perfect comparison. It just has to have something in common.
Something in common, anything in common, and you can decide what that is. Something that you want to highlight from your book.
So I think when I hear, like as a sensitivity reader, when I hear about a story written by a white person where the majority of the characters are non-white, and in a scenario, especially, I think it's especially fantasy stories, because I think that there's a common theme where people think that if they write outside of their lane, and I don't just mean outside of their experience, but outside of their lane, in a fantasy world that things are different, so they can therefore divorce the real world context and get around potential harm. And I don't think that works for two reasons. One is because as a writer, and especially as a writer from a majority group, odds are you have not examined the full extent of any internalized biases you may have. And this goes beyond just the way you might see a marginalized group, but just the way you interact with the world itself. The difference between living in a world where the defaults are made for you versus in a world where the defaults are made against you. You don't have the experience necessary to examine the defaults you are writing into your world to make sure that they're not inherently oppressive. And the other issue is that you are writing for an audience that exists in our world. So even if you say, you know, in this world, black people are not oppressed, that doesn't change the fact that harm you cause towards black people will affect real people in our world who are alive. Yeah. And so I would not say that a story written by a white person set in a fantasy world with different racial dynamics is inherently harmful. Nor would I say that it's inherently a no-go story, which is why it's not on my, like, refuse to accept list. But I do think that those are stories that tend to stray into a certain level of harm on occasion. A little more than on occasion. And I think something that is important to note here is I would not auto-reject a story like this. And I think the author meant well in asking if a story like this would be something that we would be willing to work on. But I think the implication that's missed here, and this is something that I think is very much, again, about questioning your defaults, is if I can choose one mentee out of everybody who submits to me, would I rather choose a story where, you know, there is bias written into the world building that I now have to deconstruct as a person of color, or a story where that's not an issue?
Yeah.
And I think this comes down to the idea that at the end of the day, issues of sensitivity, issues of bigotry, issues of bias are craft issues. A book that is racist, a book that is harmful, is inherently weak in terms of craft because it is failing to reach the audience the way that it should.
I agree with that.
But I also think it's worth acknowledging as a writer, if you're submitting a story that you know strays from your lane, or you know is just straight up out of your experience and you're not sure if it strays from your lane, know that while I'm sure most mentors are willing to work with that, if that ends up, you know, if it otherwise is the best book, that a book that you know could very well be harmful will essentially, you know, that's essentially like saying, you know, I know that the voice in my story is bad, but I hope you'll still consider it. Of course I'll still consider it, you know, but I will always choose a book that I feel is better rounded in terms of voice, and I will choose a book that's better rounded in terms of, you know, societal expectations and sensitivity. So yes, it is still a book you can submit to me, but I also think it's worth acknowledging that that is a weak point to your story, so it may deduct points in terms of which story I'm more likely to select if I'm down to like 3 mentee options or something like that.
Yeah. I think that there's an important distinction to make that, like, as like a white person or, you know, a straight person or abled person or whatever, is the story that you're writing about someone who is like not in your, if that's not your experience, not your lane, or does it just have that character in there? Like, I do think that there's like a huge difference, and I'm not sure 100% what if the person who asked the question is referring to like the main character is white, like the author, and then there's just like a bunch of side characters, like the cast is very diverse, or if the main character is like a person of color and the author is not. I do think there's a big difference there, especially because when we're talking about, you know, traditional publishing, if you as a white author are writing a book about, you know, let's say it's something I've seen a lot, like Egyptian mythology, you know what I mean? Or just any kind of like, you know, African mythology, Mesoamerican mythology, whatever it is, or fantasy, and you write that book and it's a really good book, and all the main characters, all the characters are of that, you know, origin and not white like the author. The problem isn't that it's not, you know, a good book, it's that you would then be taking that spot from somebody who historically has not been able to breach publishing. Like, we've seen the statistics of the demographics of people who get published. It's overwhelmingly white. Animal protagonists are published more than people of color protagonists. Like, it's pretty bad. So I would say that it's not necessarily that, like, you know, your book sucks. It's just that I, as a mentor, would want to give the opportunity to someone who is having a harder time breaking into publishing with those stories versus somebody who it's not their own culture, their own story.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, and I think that kind of came up with the Own Voices discussion that's been going on. And it's very true. Like, if you're going to be writing a story, and this applies to race, not sexuality or gender.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That conversation.
That's a separate issue. But when it comes to race, if you're going to be writing a story about characters who are unlike you, and this applies again largely to white authors because people of color writing other people of color is a little bit different. But as a white author, knowing that you have more space in the industry, knowing that your chance to get into the industry is higher, and knowing that publishing will only accept a small number of stories about any one culture or race.
Yeah.
For you to take up that space is a bit unfair. And I think to a certain extent, like, again, writing a story that happens to have a Japanese character is not something that's going to bother me. Yeah. But if you're writing a Japanese story, or a story that's, you know, that's navigating the world through a supposed Japanese lens, but that's actually through a white person's lens, not only are you taking away space from, you know, Japanese writers who are going to be barred from the story, but you're also setting a standard within publishing as to what a Japanese story will look like, because you are already more likely to get published than an actual Own Voices Japanese author.
Yeah, and now that Own Voices Japanese author is not going to be able to publish that book because they already published their Japanese book.
Exactly. They'll be like, publisher will say, we already published our Japanese book for the year, we don't need that book.
Yeah, and that happens. That happens a lot.
Writing a story about characters who are unlike you is not inherently a bad thing, but yeah, we are more inclined to accept stories Own Voices stories by people of color over white authors taking up that space just for space reasons. It's completely irrelevant. Pardon my French, I don't give a crap what your title is. And I say that with all the love in my heart. But what I genuinely mean by that is, if you send me a submission with a glorious title, I'm like, damn, that's a glorious title. If you send me a submission with a terrible title, I'm gonna say, whatever, we'll fix it later. Like, the title, if the query is good, if the book is good, I'm never gonna feel like I shouldn't read the query or shouldn't read the book because of a bad title. My titles suck. My whip titles are horrible. Like, they only become good before I like send it out somewhere that matters. Like, I don't care if the title sucks.
Yeah. I will say that like a really, really good title might make me like want to read it and be more excited about it, but no title or a bad title is not going to make me reject anything. Like, I have a whip title called The Canapal. I'm not going to spoil anything about the book, but it's called The Canapals.
Yeah, I mean, I have a whip title called Egg Whip, because it has an egg in it. The egg is largely irrelevant, but there's an egg. And like, I literally send it to people with jokes about like the amount of like egg beaters like Egg Whip would be. It's absurd. Don't worry about your title. Your title can suck, and I'll still die for your book. I don't care.
We'll still read the book.
I'm just kidding. Anything, A Day to Remember, Yellow Card, Newfound Glory, All Time Low, people. There's probably somebody watching this video who's like, oh, what are you talking about? But for anybody who gets those references, baby, come on. Yeah, any of that stuff. If it's a pop punk band, if something is like inspired by or like relative to a pop punk band, and you want to include the name of the band in the query, if I know them, I'll freak out. If I don't know them, I'll look it up. I love it. It's fine.
I mean, my favorite rom-com endings are probably happy, but that doesn't mean if it's not a happy ending, I'm not going to consider it. Just like in the books that I've read, like, I just love happy endings personally, but it doesn't have to be a happy ending for me to like want.
This is Adam Silvera slander.
No, like I said, like, you know, I read They Both Die at the End. I liked that book. It ruined me. It wrecked me completely.
Slander? I'm just kidding. I feel like when I pick up a rom-com, to a certain extent, I'm looking for a romance. So to a certain extent, I do like a happy ending. But that being said, I feel like I'm the kind of, like, douchebag who just, I like it when things mess me up or come out of left field and kind of like throw me for a spin. So,
yeah, me too.
Yeah, so I mean, a happy, unresolved, like as long as it feels satisfying and it makes sense, I don't really care if it's happy or sad. I just want to feel like, this journey has, you know, been satisfying. And so you can leave things open-ended, you can leave things unresolved, and I'm cool with that. I actually insisted on leaving something unresolved in my own book. But like, I just want it, but I just want to feel like at the end of the story, feel like I satisfied enough answers that it was worth being there. And other than that, it's kind of up to you. Do your worst. or your best, but you have to do your worst.
Yeah, it's okay to leave some things unresolved, but not everything.
Yeah, please don't leave everything unresolved.
Not too many things.
I need something.
Yeah, give me a little bit of closure. That's what I need, is I need some kind of closure. Like, it could be a sad ending, it could be a happy ending, but like, I need to feel like I can put down the book and be like, you know, like.
Yeah. Yeah, like if you leave me on a cliffhanger, we might have problems.
I would say, for the most part, no. I'm not going to assume that your book has bad rep if your comp has bad rep. but if the bad rep is so, because you know, people can miss things, and like people. And there are things that to me are like the worst rep in the world that to somebody else might not even notice, and I might still love their book and it might not have that bad rep. But if it is something so blatantly obvious, like you know, am I allowed to name names?
Only if you're okay with that person coming through for the rest of your life.
My brother's name is Jessica. If you comp something like that, I will know that the book is probably transphobic. But if you comp something so I guess that's what it is. If you comp something with a problematic premise, then I will probably assume that your book might be problematic. But if you comp something that just has a problematic element, or that like a character has, you know, is handled poorly or something like that, I'm probably not going to hold that against you.
I'm going to one-up you on that one. And what I'm going to add is, I think it depends. There's a couple different things that kind of come into play here. First of all is, how prominent is the bad rep? If the main character is, you know, a racist caricature or something like that, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
I also think it's going to depend on what you're comping to the book for. And this is why I think it can be very helpful to be specific with your comps. Because if you're going to comp to American Dirt because you're writing a Mexican character, I'm not going to feel like you can write a Mexican character. If you're comping to American Dirt because of something like some, you know, niche element in that book, I feel like I might be able to overlook it if assuming your book is about something totally different. And that was like, you know what I mean, a different like side element that you're comping to.
Yeah. I mean, and also, sorry.
Oh, wow, what were you going to say?
Also, I have seen people, like own voices people, comp to problematic books because there aren't as many own voices books out there that they feel that they can comp to. So like, if something is own voices, I'll almost always overlook the problematic aspect of the comp just because I know that maybe that was the reason for that.
That was going to be another thing I was going to say, was that it's very different if your own voices, if you include in your query that your own voices and you comp to a book that's problematic for the element that your own voice is for.
Yeah.
That does change things, because I think to a certain extent, yeah, like, I agree with that. And I think to a certain extent too, like there have been, you know, problematic books that I thought if someone whose own voices wanted to subvert this story, I would be totally okay with that. Yeah. So that is not inherently a bad thing, as long as, you know, but that's something, again, if that's something that you're not comfortable disclosing that your own voice is for, I would, again, be very careful when comping to a book that has bad rep. And it's also a couple other things to keep in mind too. Like, for instance, if you comp to a book like American Dirt, and your character is Mexican, and unless you explicitly tell me his own voices, even if I assume that your book is not problematic, I'm going to assume that you're writing it for the white gaze, because that is clearly a book written for the white gaze.
It very much is.
And I think that tells me something, and it's not necessarily something good. Yeah. I also think it's important to keep in mind, and this is not just for us, but in general, when you're comping to a book, you don't know what kind of baggage might be there for somebody. And so, you know, for instance, if you wanted to comp to She Who Must Not Be Named, that's not inherently something that everybody is going to feel a certain way about. But if you're setting that to a trans mentor, we might feel a certain way about it. So I think if you're going into a comp knowing that something is problematic, and this is again not something that you didn't realize and it slipped through, but if you know that a book is problematic, I think the best thing you can do is along with that comp. That is assuming you can't find a better comp, is make it clear that you know what's problematic about it, either by showing that, you know, your own voices and therefore are subverting it, or by just kind of saying, like, you know, barring this, working without that, like making it clear to the person you're subbing to that you're not going to re-traumatize them with the same harmful content that was in the original.
Or like doing what you said earlier by being very specific with your comp and saying you are comping to the romance or to the voice or whatever.
Yeah, or like the magic school.
The magic school, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
For me personally, there's wiggle room. If it says 1 page, don't send me 5 pages, you know, but if it goes a few lines over, that's totally fine. Like, as long as it's about, like, it doesn't have to be exactly 250 to 300 words, you know.
I'm actually gonna one-up you on that one, and I'm gonna throw the walls into chaos for a second. I actually don't really care about your synopsis, and I'm gonna be upfront about that right now. I don't really care about your synopsis. If your synopsis sucks, I don't really care, and the reason for being is because I probably won't use it, or if I do use it, it will only be because, you know, it was down to the wire and it was really. And I was like, you know, like where you're like, I really need to weed out if this book is, you know, worth reading to the end for some reason. And it's very rare that I would read a book and feel like I still wanted to keep reading it, but wasn't sure it was worth reading to the end.
Yeah.
It's almost similar in a way to like content warnings, where I'm essentially just using it to pick out pieces to make sure the things I need to be there are there. But for the most part, I'm going to be looking at your query and your pages. So that's not to say that you shouldn't put effort into your synopsis, you shouldn't write your synopsis, but it is to say I think there's a lot of emphasis both in like questions that people ask and also in a lot of like industry stuff where people are kind of like, you know, your synopsis, how to write a good synopsis. And I think one of the first piece of advice I want to give anyone writing a synopsis is take a deep breath and don't worry so much, because they are definitely not the most important part of your submission package. In fact, I would argue they're like the least important.
No one's reading your synopsis first. If they like your query and they like your book, they're not going to reject you off of the synopsis. The synopsis is just to tell us what is in the book. So, can I answer the second part of that question?
Yeah.
So, because, you know, it sucks because the synopsis is like the hardest part to write, but it is the least important to most people. I won't say to everybody, because some agents might do synopsis first, who knows. But a really easy way that I've been able to do it, to narrow it down to 1 page, is you only really need a few elements in the synopsis. You need your opening, which is like introduce your character. You need the inciting incident, sort of like that. So you need the opening, you need the inciting incident, you need the rising action, you need the climax, you need the falling action, and you need the end. So there's only 6 things you need. That's 6 paragraphs, that's a page. So you're as long as you just think of those 6 things, then you should be able to narrow it down. You don't need your subplots, you don't need like anything other than those 6 things.
And for my fellow pantsers, the easiest way to go about it, because none of that makes any sense, is to just take the most important thing that happens in each chapter and write it out in a sentence.
You do that too.
Yeah. Yeah, so basically this is how I learned to write a synopsis. You go through every chapter and you summarize it in 1 sentence. Your first chapter, your opening, your closing can be a little bit longer. They can be like maybe 2 or 3 sentences if needed. But if you can just summarize every like major chapter in 1 sentence, you'll basically have all the points that need to be included in your synopsis.
Well, that also depends on how many chapters you are, because some people might have like 20 chapters and some people have like 60. So
no, either way, you just take literally the most important part of your chapter and summarize it. And in the case where you need, like, for instance, like if your whole book is 10 chapters, 1 of your chapters are probably too long. But 2, if you're
way too long. Or your book is way too short.
But if your whole book is 10 chapters, when you summarize your key points, it'll probably break down to maybe like 2 or 3 sentences. And in that scenario, I think a lot of people will realize one of their chapters are too long. because if you can't summarize your chapters, your average chapter in about a sentence or two, your chapter is probably too long. But I think that's also where people start to realize that, and this is Panther specifically, start to realize that you don't have enough tension in your book. Is when you go to write the synopsis and you realize that there are a lot of chapters that you either have too much going on, they can't be summarized in a sentence. Almost all of your chapters have to be summarized like a paragraph. That means there's too much going on. Or you go to write it and you realize that one chapter doesn't even need a sentence because nothing in it was important enough. That's when you know that you have to shake. So I guess that is our video. And if you have any other questions, you can always contact us. I'm assuming you have your contact information on the wish list page. Yes. So if you go to our wish list pages, which I will link below, you will find the best way to reach us with any questions that you have. And also, while you're at it, go ahead and check out the other mentors, get a feel for why you're going to submit to me instead of them, and then
or me instead of them.
No, me instead of them. And then once you've gotten your answers, just if you have any questions, let us know. And we look forward to hearing from all of you. Kelsey, maybe you should have closed the door.
I think we should pick him up so that they can see the dog.
He came running the second he heard my voice.
Jemson, let's show the audience
Okay, let's go on the
who you are.
Blooper reel.
Blooper reel.
This is James. Look at the camera! Look at the camera!
Do the
Listen.
thing where it like goes between my armpit.
No, I write this, and it's actually sharp.
Okay.
But I'm just saying.
Do it really slowly, and then we can speed it up in post production.
Stop.